All right, so we're going to go over Punnett squares. There are only 6 total possible Punnett squares that can exist. And once you know those 6, you know every possible Punnett square for the scenario of one gene with 2 alleles, a dominant allele and a recessive allele. If we're talking about diploid individuals, that means that we have 3 possible genotypes: homozygous dominant, 2 capital letters, heterozygous, 1 of each, and homozygous recessive. The phenotypes, in this case, we have 2. We have the dominant phenotype, which is what you're going to see with either of these genotypes, 1 big A or 2 big A's. And we have the recessive phenotype, which you only see in an individual that has 2 recessive alleles. So the different scenarios that can exist, these are kind of 2 different platforms, but you can have a mom with the dominant trait and a dad with the dominant trait. You can have both parents with the recessive trait, and then you can have different combinations of the phenotypes where one of the parents is dominant and one is recessive. Similarly, with the genotypes, you can have both parents heterozygous, both homozygous, or you can have different mixes as well. So we're going to start by looking at the possible scenarios when you're looking at the dominance and the recessiveness of the parents' traits. So first up, if both parents show the recessive phenotype, that means that both parents have to have the two lowercase letters for their genotype, because the only possible way for the parents to show the recessive trait is to have 2 recessive alleles. So then if we make our Punnett square, the 2 possible gametes for the father would be lowercase a is the only possible gamete that father can make. Lowercase a is the only possible gamete that female parent can make. And so 2 parents with recessive phenotypes, 100% of their children would have homozygous recessive genotype, and 100% of their children would show the recessive trait or the recessive phenotype. That's the only possibility if both parents are recessive. There's only one possible Punnett square. If both parents are dominant, you have multiple possibilities. So if both parents are dominant, you could have both parents homozygous dominant. You could have one parent homozygous dominant and one parent heterozygous, but showing the dominant trait. Or you could have both parents heterozygous. So take a second and just confirm with yourself that these are the only 3 different combinations if both parents show the dominant phenotype. This is the same as writing big A, that times that. It doesn't matter what order you write them in. So those are the only possibilities for both parents dominant. So if we write our Punnett squares, we have big A, that means all of the mother's eggs will have a big A allele for whatever gene this is. All of the father's gametes will have a big A allele for whatever this gene is. If they are both homozygous dominant, it's very similar to the homozygous recessive, 100% homozygous dominant, 100% the dominant trait. If you have dominant parent, homozygous dominant with heterozygous, both parents showing the dominant trait, in this case, all of the kids are going to show the dominant traits. 100% of the kids are going to show the dominant trait. But it's going to be 50-50 for the genotype. So 50% will be heterozygous, 50% homozygous dominant. But if one of the parents is homozygous dominant, all the kids have to be homozygous dominant, have to have the dominant trait, because they all had to get the capital letter from that parent. So that's that option, that's that option. And then our third Punnett square, this is probably the most special Punnett square, because both parents show the dominant trait, but because both parents are heterozygous, it is special in that it's the only Punnett square where you're going to get a child that doesn't match either parent. This is where Oops, I gotta move this up. This is where generations of poor children get teased about like being adopted because they don't look like either parent and they don't look like any of their siblings. But that's exactly what you would predict when you have two parents that are heterozygous. They're gonna have 75% chance, or about 3 out of 4 of their children showing the dominant trait, just like the parents show the dominant trait. But you're going to have a 25% chance, or about 1 out of every 4 kids showing the recessive trait, which is going to be different than the siblings and the parents. So this is the only Punnett square where you're going to get the child that has a completely different phenotype than either parent. Okay, because in this case, both parents are dominant. The kids are all dominant too, trait. In this case, both parents are recessive, the kids are all recessive too. But in this case, both parents are dominant, but you have the kid who's recessive. And our only last option, both parents are recessive, both parents are dominant, or it can be a mixture, one parent dominant, one parent recessive. And if you have one parent dominant and one parent recessive, then obviously the kids are going to look like one of the parents no matter what. They're either going to be dominant or recessive. Dominant parent and a recessive parent. Now for the dominant and the recessive parent, now there's 2 different ways to be a dominant parent. You can be homozygous dominant, or you can be heterozygous and have the dominant trait. There's only one way to have the recessive trait. So we're going to have 2 Punnett squares. One if it's homozygous dominant with the recessive parent, one if it's heterozygous with the recessive parent. So in this case, if we have, let's say the father is the recessive parent, in this case, the mother is homozygous dominant. All of the kids are going to show the dominant trait just like the mother, but they're also all going to have the recessive allele that they got from the father. So 100% dominant trait for the children, 100% heterozygous for the genotype. That's that option. And then the other option is heterozygous parent, dominant trait, and recessive trait parent, recessive genotype. And in this case, you get half of the parent, or sorry, half the kids have the recessive trait, half the kids have the dominant trait. And the same percentages, 50% dominant trait, heterozygous. So this is every single Punnett square that exists, that is possible. And the only possible ways to have a child that shows the recessive trait, either if both parents are recessive, all the children are recessive. If both parents are heterozygous, you have a 1 in 4 chance of getting a child that shows the recessive trait. Or the only other way to have recessive children, other than 2 heterozygous parents or 2 parents that are that have the recessive trait, is 1 parent who's recessive and 1 parent who is dominant heterozygous. In that case, you get 50% chance of having the recessive trait. And that's everything. And so we could also lay this out like homozygous. You know, we could find that would be this one if it's dominant with recessive, this one dominant with dominant, this one recessive with recessive. You know, you can go through and do those other ones the other way as well. But this just shows us every possibility for every Punnett square. Both parents recessive, all the kids are recessive, there's only the small a alleles. Both parents dominant, you have 3 options. The only one that doesn't have all of the children being also dominant is if both parents are heterozygous. And then you have a dominant parent and a recessive parent. If the dominant parent is homozygous dominant, all the kids are also dominant. If the dominant parent is heterozygous, then it's 50-50.